test, or the sham assessment, which we know comes ultimately from a disability denial insurance scam, really. That it wasn't a true assessment. It was ignoring the difficulties people were facing, and it was actually making people's mental health conditions worse, which seemed counterproductive. And we were aware people were dying. We knew people who were dying.
Workfare means forced unpaid work for people on benefits. If you're claiming out-of-work benefits, will be forced to do unpaid work, and if you refuse to do that work, your benefits will be sanctioned. They'll be completely stopped for at least 4 weeks. Thousands of people are sanctioned every month, and refusing to participate in workfare programs is the top reason that people are sanctioned. So this means basically that doing forced unpaid work becomes a condition on the receipt of benefits, and workfare creates a workforce of claimants without the normal legal protections and rights of paid workers.
Psychocompulsion in workfare involves claimants having to undergo certain psychological interventions. So that's quite a wide programme of change your attitudes, change your feelings, change your belief interventions. They can be packaged as increase your motivation, become more confident, increase your self-esteem. They can involve direct psychological referral, or they might involve so-called jobs coaching or psychometric testing to identify your strengths, or a whole series of positive messaging, so emails sent straight to your inbox with positive psychology messages.
Psychological conditionality also is part of a sort of broader trend in which the criteria for being sent on workfare programs are made into characteristics about the claimant's psychology. So, for example, one reason for being sent on mandatory work activity programs is lack of motivation, and the judgment of these kind of very broad psychological characteristics is entirely at the discretion of job centre staff. If they think you don't look like you're trying hard enough, then you can be sent to do unpaid work, which is supposed to be what gives you the motivation.
What led to this is really worth reflecting on and thinking about. This is not just a question of a repeat of the deserving and undeserving poor. This is about who is to blame for people's misery, whether it's physical disability, whether it's, in big quotes, mental health, because there's no such thing as mental health, but we have to use this phrase, or whether it's being jobless. These things are being reconstructed as matters of individual failing and individual responsibility.
We knew that these tests were then being conducted by people who had medical training, but it wasn't the right medical training, and we were dealing with people's very sensitive issues. It's probably a lot easier to assess a physical disability. You can get readings for that, you can get x-rays, you can get supporting evidence, and in a fairly short assessment interview you can actually do a physical examination and determine for yourself that there's a limb missing, for example. Much harder to do with mental health, and but we were aware people who'd been on benefits for a long time, who'd been on disability living allowance for a long time, were suddenly finding their benefits completely cut and being told that they had to now look for work.
Employability is a shift from what you have to do to get a job, so fill in a certain number of CVs, go on a certain number of interviews, to what you have to be. What you have to be increasingly is a very narrow set of characteristics. You have to be optimistic, positive, aspirational, motivated. And what that in effect means is that the state, via the job centre, and a whole range of subcontracted contractors, so the whole welfare to work industry, are scrutinising and surveying your basic attitudes and beliefs and feelings. And so you get a huge emphasis on what is job ready, what is the perfect employable person. And psychology is aiding and abetting that shift. The idea that a narrow range of attributes are what's required for you to be employable. So you get industry moguls saying positive attitude is the foundation of employability. Well, they would say that. And in cahoots with the cabinet, reeking of privilege, you hear people talking about the requirement for a positive attitude, a sort of happy, clappy, la-la land workforce, which is both dishonest and also extremely dangerous. It's requiring people claiming benefits and low-paid workers to suspend their critical faculties. And so the shift to employability includes all that sort of emphasis on being a certain type of person, and constructs like psychological resistance to work and cultures of worklessness. These are a whole range of attempts to portray unemployment and claiming benefits as a psychological deficit, and they have very damaging implications.
It's constantly about how do we block out the very real barriers to people with mental health issues getting into work. How do we ignore those completely and focus on the things that would mean they would be able to do some kind of a job? Can you dial a telephone? Can you sit in a chair for 20 minutes? I mean, one of the most bizarre things I remember was a woman being told she was wheelchair bound, needed the wheelchair, but without the wheelchair she was forced to lie on the floor, but she could move one arm, and they were like, well, you could have a job which could involve lying on the floor and pushing a button, which I suppose she could, but does such a job even exist? The whole thing goes into its own craziness, really. We're supposed to be the people who are mad, but really the system itself it beggars belief. There doesn't seem to be much sanity in what they're doing. I had a psychiatrist before. I had been in intensive treatment before. They knew about my history. They knew that it goes back to childhood trauma. It's been compounded by a lot of different trauma along the way, and other people are having the same experience, that there is just nothing. It has been pared back to the bone. And in effect, what's happened is a lot of people have ended up in alcohol and drug services because they've had a more open door policy, and people have ended up self-medicating in the face of a complete lack of any appropriate treatment. And then on top of that came this announcement that they were going to start providing therapy, which we couldn't get through our CMHTs anymore, but suddenly that there were going to be therapists in job centres. Now, the job centres are places that people fear, because ultimately going there means that you risk putting yourself in a position where you do not have the means to survive in this society.
My name's Phil Thomas. I'm a writer. I was a consultant psychiatrist in the NHS for over 20 years. I came out of clinical practice in 2004 in order to focus on writing. Neoliberalism is a political ideology that holds, in essence, that the best way we can all live a good life is by liberating and setting free individual entrepreneurial freedom, so that we can create money, create wealth, and the idea is that in doing that we can create a better society. It originated, well, there's a lot of debate about when it originated. Clearly it relates originally to 19th century ideas about liberalism, but it originated really, I think, with the policies of Ronald Reagan in the USA and Margaret Thatcher in this country. And some of the consequences of neoliberalism are, for example, the shrinking down and minimisation of the role of the state, especially as far as providing benefits for people is concerned. creating, liberating entrepreneurs so that they can actually carry on the business of creating wealth. And that means deregulation of business, of industry, so that people, to make it a lot easier, in fact, I think the theory is to enable people to make money and to create wealth. The problem with that, and especially important as far as mental health is concerned, is that there's a huge amount of evidence that over the last 30 years, since neoliberalism, certainly in this country, has really come to the fore, that the policy has actually been incredibly ineffective. Indeed, it's failed at creating at improving the lot of ordinary people. And the evidence for that is the growth of inequality, income inequality, that in America and in England, in UK, the two countries which I suppose for many people really epitomise the sort of neoliberal sort of tendency over the last 30 years, that these are the two countries with the highest levels of income inequality in the so-called rich countries of the world. And associated with that, there's also a huge amount of evidence that those inequalities are associated and linked to a wide range of individual, personal problems, mental health problems, chronic illness, family breakdown, other forms of social, I suppose you might describe them as social malaise, things like crime, teenage pregnancy, and so forth. I'm not saying that there's a causal link between income inequality, but the evidence is so strong and it comes from so many different countries that actually it's very difficult to say that the two aren't in some way very closely related.
So psychological fundamentalism is attempting to explain what happens in your life, health, wealth, employment, in terms of supposed psychological attributes. And positive psychology privileges certain attributes. So it says that a successful person will exhibit certain characteristics. And there's a familiar roll call of those: high self-esteem, very confident, very motivated, very aspirational, very get up and go. And it does that without any reference to the fact that those attributes are contested and not everybody agrees that that kind of happy clappy go get 'em, trample on everybody while you're on your way up is positive. And at one level, many of these ideas that come out of positive psychology, they're completely laughable, and they've been the subject of extensive satire, particularly from the anti-poverty movement, from the disability rights movement, from mental health campaigners. But when those messages are underpinned by a secret penal system, when they're underpinned by decision makers who have more power to take away your means of subsistence than the magistrates' court. So when those positive psychology messages are underpinned by that, they become less laughable and deeply, deeply damaging. So behind all of this, there is the reality that people, on the basis of decision makers who have very arbitrary power, can strip you of the means to live.
Positive psychology and CBT are, I think, very important as far as neoliberalism ideology is concerned. In essence, the argument is that if individual success in life is to be understood in terms of the individual's decisions, the individual's beliefs about him or herself, and so forth, then then how are we to understand and make sense of individual or personal failure? It's part of a problem to do with the individual. It's an individual problem. It's not part of the broader social, economic, or political contexts in which that individual is set. So there's a real interest, as far as neoliberalism is concerned, in maintaining this, well, I would call it a mythology, that individual failure, being unemployed, being sick, being disabled, whatever it is, some individual failure is a function of the individual. It's the individual's problem, the moral responsibility for that rests with the individual person, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the broader context in which that individual lives. So the really important thing about positive psychology, CBT, even mindfulness for that matter, is that they are approaches ostensibly set out and established to help the individual person to deal with what is essentially an individual problem. In other words, it individualizes the problem. It really fails to engage with the broader social, political and economic contexts in which that individual is situated.
It could be argued that what psychotherapy and counselling do is very far from blaming the client, blaming the subject for the state that she is in, because they blamed the client's father or mother or someone who maltreated or abused the client. But that's just a shifting sideways of the individual perspective on this. It still doesn't have a systemic perspective. We know now, in theory, but less so in practice up to now, that the inner world, so-called, is completely irradiated with what comes into it from outside. That's why therapist clients talk a lot about economic injustice, environmental despoliation, war and violence. Their inner worlds, and hence their distress, has actually begun to move away from mum, away from dad, away from the terrible school, and actually out into the world. However, unfortunately, most therapists still tend to interpret the client's expressed concern about a political or social theme as a kind of projection of an issue to do with the client, so that horrid, dogmatic, dictatorial leaders, well, that's obviously dad, isn't it? Economic injustice, things are not fair in this world, that's a nasty mum, isn't it? No, it is what it says it is. And the problem is that therapists haven't worked out perspectives to dialogue with their clients about the world in the privacy of the session.
I think it's important to point out that positive psychology and CBT are so important to the government's management of the unemployed, people who are receive benefits, benefit claimants, people with disabilities, people with mental health problems, that they've really turned their attention big time on those groups. And so they've recruited, and we've seen this certainly over the last 12 months since the government, the last Tory government was elected, in a growing tendency to what Lynn Friedley and her colleagues have called psychocompulsion. That is that benefit claimants, people with disabilities, mental health problems, are forced and coerced into receiving psychological, so-called psychological therapies such as positive psychology or CBT, and they're forced into that by being told that right, you're going to have this course of therapy in the job centre usually, and if you refuse to comply with it, we'll sanction you, we'll stop your benefits.
Recently we were looking at a programme for a doctors training day and conference, and they were offering hour-long sessions on how to make use of CBT, and how GPs can make use of CBT in 10-minute sessions. You just think, this is just playing with fairy dust.
And so I think the problem here is that unwittingly a great large number of psychologists, therapists are being sucked into what is effectively a form of political coercion serving the interests of neoliberalism.
Now, the therapists who so eagerly protested against all of this, me included, should have waited a couple of minutes and thought about their possible contribution to this weird ideology of you are to blame for being in a pickle. Because to a certain extent, notions of autonomy, notions of growth, notions of realizing your full potential, individuation, self-actualization, even the Freudian nonsense of genitality, all these things speak to the individual explanation for whatever kind of social issue we're talking about. So I think that the lack amongst the mass of therapists who supported these protests of an understanding that they too are part of the privatization of everything, that they too lack a sustained meta-analysis, a sociological or political analysis of what's going on. It would have been perhaps a little more seemly. I'm proud of the profession for speaking up and defending its ethics, but I don't think we really all thought through to what extent we are caught up in the neoliberal project. And by the way, you don't get round it by doing therapy in groups or peer counselling or something like that. Therapy is wedded to a whole set of standards and principles that constitute liberal individualism. Maybe that could change, or maybe not. But the fact is, we are implicated as well as bearing witness to what the British government is doing at this moment in relation to the privatisation and individualisation of misery.
A growing number of psych professionals, so psychologists, psychotherapists, etc., are expressing growing concern about the way in which psychology is being used, both to support austerity and also to support a welfare to work rhetoric. And more psychologists are joining forces with campaigners like Workfare, like Mental Health Resistance Network, to oppose the misuse of psychology and particularly to raise questions about the ethics of delivering psychotherapy in coercive environments.
But what we still need from those psychological professionals is a visible and a united and a public campaign against the misuse of psychological therapies, against the misuse of psychological discourse to legitimate the kind of things that the Department for Work and Pension is doing at the moment. We need them to organise and to arrange for non-participation in these kind of treatments. We need them to realise that it's not only in cases where having a certain treatment is made absolutely and explicitly a condition on receiving benefits. We have to see what kind of an environment the job centre is and what kind of a place the welfare to work industry is. And we need psychological professionals to refuse to participate in that, to refuse to participate in the ideology of the work cure.
I think also we need to start challenging the idea that work is wonderful, and the idea that a society wholly dominated by work is in all our interests, because work is not delivering an income people can live on for millions and millions of people. It's consuming people's time, their health, their creativity, their relationships. Far from work curing, work is destroying in many cases, and we need a much more honest debate about that. And the extent to which psychology has been co-opted into the work is wonderful agenda is seriously damaging. It's also deeply dishonest. So there is a need for a much more critical look at the idea that unemployment and claiming benefits are psychological disorders, and that those disorders of claiming benefits and being unemployed should be cured via work.
The real problem here is that these approaches actually make it very, very difficult for individuals to come together and to take some sort of collective action. And there's a very strong view, I think, certainly one that I have, is that the most important way of setting people free is to bring them together so that they can actually share their experiences, identify the sources of their oppression and their misery, and take action of some sort or another against that.
The real thing that I think is happening here is not about saving the money, not about reducing the welfare bill, not yet. But it is about changing the thinking and the culture of the society. The Tories want a much more compliant, much more conformist, and much more accepting of nonsense workforce. And part of that is they've done it before. They've made people dig holes and fill them in, chasing after non-existent jobs for 35 hours a week, will knock the stuffing out of people, and it will stop them getting together and protesting. Plus, if they no longer have communities because they no longer have stable housing, then we are in this position where life is so precarious, we're forced to compete for jobs that there aren't enough to go around, and which become harder and harder because they keep pushing the retirement age back. So jobs aren't being freed up by people retiring, so young people aren't being given a chance to move into them. There's this incredible scramble going for what in effect are lowly paid, insecure, unstimulating, unsatisfying jobs, which leave us, I think are not good for our mental health, do not make us feel good about ourselves, and are serving solely to make the already far too rich even richer. And, they're sitting there, they're having these extravagant lifestyles, turning up in these extravagant vehicles, living in these massive houses of which they have several, and we're creating this wealth for them. And they are pissing on us. This is a global phenomenon, and the thing in common with all of these things are the corporations. Those are what are taking over our lives. Those are what are pushing us towards fascism. They are the ones that have the power. They are the ones that have the ears of the politicians and the money to bribe the politicians. And that is the real fight, and that's the bit that is really hard to get hold of.
Which, as you can see from the sign over there, is called the Employment Academy. Now what has an Employment Academy got to do with people suffering from mental health issues? They say if we get jobs, we'll feel better. But we've got news for them. We've got a new banner, it's coming out in a minute. It says working isn't working.